Stacy Murphy here, and it's getting warmer in the northern hemisphere. And while this may seem like a strange time to be thinking about this, I've got pests and diseases on my mind. Typically, people are thinking about pests and diseases later in the season when it starts to warm up and you can start to see all the pests and diseases all over your food. And this makes sense because pest populations, they peak essentially when our vegetable crop production peaks, and that makes sense because that's when there's more habitat for them, and that's when the weather is more beneficial for them to reproduce and to colonize all of our food. So instead of thinking about this later, I like to think about prevention strategies that I can include in my practices now so that I can keep those little buggers from eating all my food. And if you're like me and you see yourself growing in partnership with Mother Nature, then you know that all these insects and these fungi and these bacteria, they're all a part of the party that is growing food. And so I see my role as a land steward as somebody who just, gently nudges pests and diseases away from my food and maybe suggest an alternate habitat where they might thrive, again, away from my food. My food, you hear me, flea beetle? I'm talking to you. And with that said, my goal is never to eradicate all pests and diseases because ultimately I would fail at that goal. It's totally unreasonable. So instead, my goal is to keep pest populations low and manageable so that I can enjoy my harvest and I manage the early stages of disease. Now, while I'm on the subject of accepting pests as part of the project process, so we call them pests because they're eating our food. But if they weren't there, what would all of the ladybugs and the praying mantis and the wasps, what would they eat? It's all part of one ecosystem, and you can't have one without the other. So if I want to see the beneficial insects, then I've got to be okay that there might be a couple aphids around. A couple, right? And the trick is to keep them from populating and colonizing and taking over all of your food. And that's where prevention strategies come in. And while there are loads of ways that you can prevent these populations from colonizing and eating all your food, in this particular video, I'm going to share just 3 that aren't talked about so much. And these are 3 prevention strategies that you can start doing right now. And I'm going to switch over to my slides so you can follow along. So what kind of preventative strategies can you adopt in order to grow your food pest and disease free? And before we get into these 3 strategies, the first thing to understand is how diseases spread so we understand how we might be able to stop them. So there are 3 conditions that make plants susceptible to diseases, and all 3 have to be present at the same time in order for that plant to catch that disease. So the pathogen has to be present. The plant has to be susceptible to that particular disease, and there has to be favorable conditions for that disease to thrive. For instance, in a case of a fungal disease, that travels typically by air currents, and so it needs to be warm and moist and a little breezy for those fungal conditions to transfer across space. So of these 3 conditions, which ones do we really have any control over? Well, we have a little bit of control whether or not a pathogen is present. There are some that travel by air and we have no control over that, but then there are some diseases which are transferable by touch, and we have a little bit of control over being careful how we touch our plants and how we spread soil. The second is that the plant has to be susceptible to that disease, and we have the most control here because we can produce a very healthy plant which will be less susceptible to getting those diseases. So even though, let's say, a squash plant may be very susceptible to powdery mildew in particular, the healthier our plant is, the less likely it is to actually contract that disease. And then the third thing, those favorable conditions, like I said, some of them are within our control, but some of them are not. So let's say that this fungal disease, this powdery mildew of this cucumber, is spread by air. Well, a couple things we can do is we can thin out our cucumber plants in order to create more airspace around them so that it has a harder time to land on our plants. So we can do a couple things there, but the most control that we have is to grow a healthy plant. And so, how do we grow healthy plants? Well, really, healthy plants start with healthy soil. So, you want to improve the health of your soil with good quality compost each year before you get started. And this is your first preventative strategy in order to prevent pests and diseases. And how does compost improve plant health? Well, it works kind of indirectly, it's not something that's one to one. So, how it works is that compost is adding nutrients to your soil. You're adding carbon, you're adding nitrogen back into your soil and a whole bunch of other trace elements. Compost then increases the microbial life of your soil. All of the microorganisms that are based in your compost are now boosting your soil's microbial level. Compost improves the water retention of your soil, regardless of what type of soil you have, whether it's clay or sand. By adding compost, more and more water can be held in that soil like a sponge for very healthy soil. And because all of these things are taking place, this is improving the overall health of your soil, compost is. And by improving the overall health of your soil, then you are improving the health of your plants. And we've already mentioned that plants that are healthier are less susceptible to disease. So we have indirectly decreased our plants' susceptibility to disease by producing very healthy plants. So that this is your first primary strategy to prevent pests and diseases. And the recommendation always is to add 2 inches of compost to all of your planting beds every year at the start of the season. And this is assuming your planting beds are at least 6 inches deep, because you can go overboard on the compost. You do want some soil in there as well. And what do? Well, you just basically dump it on top of your planting beds and incorporate it into your bed. So the next type of strategy is more about pests. And so to talk about the next preventative strategy, it's important to understand what a pest wants. And a pest pretty much wants food and habitat in order to breed and reproduce, very much like a lot of inhabitants of the planet. And so one of our goals is cutting off the pest's food supply before they cut off ours. And so let's say you were trying to avoid a certain pest, and I'm going to take a pest that is very dear to my heart, the squash vine borer. So the squash vine borer is something that grows on zucchini plants and summer squash plants, which have hollow stems. And so in order to avoid this pest, which this particular pest I don't enjoy working with, because I like to neglect my plants and do as little work as possible. And when I neglect my zucchini and I neglect my summer squash, I end up with no food, because basically the squash vine borer cuts off the circulation of the plant before I ever get any fruit. So this happens to be in my area that there's no way for me to get food off this plant without doing some work on this particular pest, and I choose not to. So instead, I grow a variety that is pest resistant to the squash vine borer. And so instead of growing zucchini or summer squash, I opt for a squash gourd hybrid, which has a solid stem and therefore is not susceptible to the squash vine borer. And I still get tons of squash. So tromboncino is one that's shown here on the screen. It's similar to the butternut squash. You can see it's like a winter gourd hybridized with a summer squash. And so you get this long-necked kind of swan-looking creature that as it ages, it becomes a winter gourd and actually turns yellow. But you can harvest this thing when it's like 6 or 8 inches long, and it tastes just like zucchini, and it has a soft skin just like zucchini, but as it gets older and older, it gets a tougher skin. Another squash gourd hybrid is the cucuzza, which is also an Italian hybrid, and you can see here that some of these gourds can reach up to 4 feet long. The longer they are, the more fibrous they are, so you have to cook them more. So I recommend, cutting them off when they're 8 inches long, and they're very soft and tender and delicious. And because it's a vining crop, you can grow it up any kind of surface. And there are 2 other squash gourds that I don't have any experience with that I have found other people talk about. One is the trailing green marrow, and the other is the Guyana australis. So some of those are pictured here as well for reference. All right, so that was your second strategy, was to grow to choose varieties at the start of the season. Here we are at the start of the season in North America. Pick varieties that are less susceptible to particular types of pests. The third strategy, again, we're going back to this concept. What does a pest want? It wants food and habitat to breed and reproduce. So our goal is cutting off the pest's food supply before they cut off ours. And one of the ways to do that this is true for your whole season, not just for your early spring, but for your whole season, is to harvest your food regularly and eat your food before the pests do. Now, the crops that this is particularly important for are the green leafy vegetables. On your screen here is a giant kale or collard plant, can't tell which, and it is so overgrown. There is so much food on this plant and there is so much space for pests. It's kind of ridiculous. You don't need to have this much food out in your garden at any one particular time. If you harvest weekly, you'll have much less food on the vine, and there'll be much less space for pests to infiltrate. And so what you want to do, I would say, still plant your greens really densely, and oftentimes planting greens densely will bring in the pests because they're like, hey, look at all that food out there. But when you harvest it weekly and keep it really clean, that keeps the area of leaf area really down to a minimum for those pests. And here's what I mean. Here are kale plants that are properly harvested weekly, and you'll notice that there's just a couple leaves at the top and that there isn't all that bushiness for all those pests to sit on. So there are 3 preventative strategies that you can start implementing today. There are tons more. For instance, you could go out today and you could disinfect all of your tools for the season and make sure there's no residual diseases from last year that you're going to bring into this year's garden. Remember, pests and diseases are completely manageable. The goal is really here that you have less pests, less disease, and more food for you. See you in the next video.